Together, we work as one for better LGBTIQ lives. Outright.
So my name is Leah Thompson. I'm one of the Caribbean advocacy officers at Outright International. I will be guiding you through today's program, and we will be jumping right into it. So from a programming perspective, we're going to have two in-person sessions today. The first is going to be on how conversion practices in Africa violate human rights, and that's going to be hosted by our Africa advocacy officer. The second is going to be on pathways to decriminalization of same-sex intimacy, hosted by our executive director. So on that note, I'd ask you all to give a warm welcome to our executive director, Maria Sjödin.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for watching on Zoom or Facebook, virtually, or watching afterwards with the recordings. It's really exciting to be here at a hybrid Out Summit and actually have people in the room, so it feels really great. And we're looking forward to a lively discussion with all of you today. If you don't know Outright, you saw the brief introductory video. If we describe our work in 4 ways, we amplify, meaning we make sure that people around the world who advocate for LGBTIQ lives are heard. We advocate, that's how we change the world. We support by training, grants, all kinds of ways to make our movement stronger, because without the movement, we cannot see the change that we want to see. And when we do see the change, we celebrate. There are many things that are hard about advocating for LGBTIQ lives globally, but there are wins, and we have to celebrate them. I want to do a big thank you to Microsoft for hosting those of us who are here in person in their UN offices with a beautiful view. And with that, I want to welcome Microsoft Philanthropies Corporate Vice President, Kate Behncken.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Behncken, and I lead Microsoft Philanthropies. And I'm also the executive sponsor of the LGBTIQ Employee Network in our Corporate External and Legal Affairs Department here at Microsoft. I want to give a really warm welcome to everyone joining online or in person. I'm dialing in here from Seattle at our mothership, and I wish I was able to be there in person in New York today. We're really honoured to have the opportunity to host Out Summit in our UN offices in New York. I know you'll all join me in a special thanks to Maria Sjödin, Executive Director, and also the entire Outright International team for over 3 decades, for over 30 years of leadership, strengthening the protection of LGBTIQ human rights worldwide, including through the United Nations. I also want to thank Outright International for their leadership and everything that they bring to the partnership for global LGBTI equality. We're really proud at Microsoft to be a founding member of this partnership, which benefits tremendously from Outright's expertise, their research, their networks, all their support. As Outright International knows better than anyone, we continue to see mixed progress in the recognition and protection of the human rights of LGBTIQ people. Building community remains the most efficient way to provide a safe space where everyone feels heard, seen, and inspired. As with many societal issues, advancing the rights of LGBTIQ people around the world requires strong collaboration across sectors. When NGOs, governments, and private sector really work together, we can better protect, respect, and fulfill the human rights of LGBTIQ people. So thank you and enjoy the summit.
Thank you so much, Kate. And just as a little background, today's event, Out Summit Live, marks the culmination of Advocacy Week 2022, which just concluded last week, as well as the first day of our 3-day Out Summit Conference. This year's Advocacy Week brought together 16 activists from around the world for a week of high-level meetings at UN delegations and agencies. And we are very, very lucky to have most of them here in the room with us here today for these panel discussions on really critical human rights issues within our community. Out Summit is a virtual event, so apart from today's panels, we actually have 800 people that are joining our sessions. Sessions on topics ranging from justice for gender persecution at the International Criminal Court, topics ranging from trans people's struggles to access healthcare and legal gender recognition in the Caribbean, and many more. For those of you who have not, you can still register at outrightinternational.org for the rest of this 3-day conference. So we'll now kick off to our 2 panels. We'll go straight from the first panel into the second. So I'll have to make this announcement. If anyone needs to pause, use the restroom, they are to the left and down the hallway. Just tap me on my shoulder. I'm right in the corner there if you get lost. And I now turn over to our first moderator, Kanyo Farise, to introduce herself and her panelists and to start this panel on eradicating conversion practices around the world. Thank you, Kanyo.
Thank you. As Maria and Leah have well put it, Out Summit brings together members of diverse movements, including human rights activists, community leaders, government officials, funders, allies, and others across the world. So this is an opportunity for us to celebrate, to learn, to connect, and to inspire one another. My name is Kanyo Farise. I am the Africa Advocacy Officer at Outright, and I'm not alone for this panel. I am joined by an esteemed group of speakers. The first is Steve Letsike, the Executive Director of Access Chapter 2. Please join me, Steve. I'm also joined by Eve Odwar from Galk Plus in Kenya, Operations Manager. Also Remy, the Executive Director of Tears from Nigeria, as well as Yanzi Peng from LGBT Rights Advocacy China, founder and director. So as I think the introduction has really well put it, this conversation is going to be looking at conversion practices across the world. And we will briefly highlight some of the key findings which came out from the research that Outright and partners did on conversion practices, but we'll also look at threats and opportunities to making progress in this area. And over the next, I hope, 40 minutes or so, we hope that we'll just ask a few questions of our panelists, and then they will respond to that, but we really want to also engage with you and ask and respond to any of the questions you may have. So I encourage you to put your questions, comments in the chat box, but also in the room. We will have time for questions and answers. So with that, we'll get into our first question for our panelists. As mentioned, in about 2019, Outright commenced research on the nature, extent, and impact of conversion practices. This was first done through a global report, which was led by our researchers here at Outright, which really looked at conversion practices all over the world and how they manifest. But from that, it was very clear that from the African context, there's just not enough data, or in fact, there was barely any information on how these practices manifest, who's impacted by them, who are the key perpetrators of these harmful practices, and how do they impact people across the world. So in Africa, led by Tears, Galk, and Access Chapter 2, it was clear that of almost 3,000 people, LGBTQ+ persons who were interviewed, more than half of them said they had experienced some form of conversion practice. So that made it quite clear that these practices do exist. They are far wide on the continent, very prevalent, and they have very serious harmful impacts on people's lives. We also found that these practices take on various forms, including what we've put as maybe physical types of conversion practices, which include assault, so-called corrective rape, and other forms which could amount to torture. But there are also non-physical forms which include talk therapy and therapy in inverted commas, as of course this is not therapeutic, and various other findings. So with that, I think my first question to you, Steve, will be of the findings of your research on conversion practices in South Africa. What are you most concerned with at this stage?
Thank you so much, Kanyo. Good morning, everyone. No, it's afternoon, it's afternoon, it's afternoon. Oh, good day. Here we are. There we are, there we are. We're still, this is our first panel, physical panel. We've had other panels, and really congratulations, to Outright International for bringing all of us together. Look, Kanyo, I think for me, we really are having these conversations when many lives, many people are in danger. And particularly young LGBTI people. And I think we move around with the hopes that when many of our countries got into independence, and I'll give you a scenario, and this is a practical recent scenario. When many of our countries got into independence, we moved with the idea of what we call democracy. And we adopted constitutions. South Africa is a very young democracy, which was only born in 1994. Now, you've got many young people born after 1994, which we regard in our country as we call them the born frees. But just in the last, at least in the last couple of months, the last 4 months, we've buried just over 8 young LGBTI people. 5 of them committed suicide. Others were murdered. Now, I want to make this example as a practical example to say that many of these born frees are not free. Because they actually think this constitution that we fought for, and many people before us fought for, will work for them. So they also do not have that level of resilience or resistance that you and I have that were born before democracy, which we continue to fight. So what is my concern today of the research is that conversion practice still takes place in many shapes. Its practices, its words, its action, its hatred, its pushback. Hearing it not only just from our families, we are hearing it from teachers, nurses, pastors. Every day, people hear hate. So there's no way we can't be concerned when this comes at the cost of life. And young people, like we've seen in our research across the countries, also here where I come from in South Africa, many LGBTI people have experienced conversion practice when they were young, when they were children. And in the interest of putting the children's life back on our agenda as a priority, we need to prioritize that, because conversion practice follows children to adulthood. It follows them. When we speak about substance use and abuse, when we speak about homelessness, lack of economic opportunities, and all of, there's a ripple effect. So for me, the interest is that we need to prioritize young people. We need to make sure that their rights as young people are protected and they are promoted.
Very important there, Steve, highlighting the very severely negative impacts on young people. And not only in South Africa, the continent at large, predominantly made of young people, which means so many are at risk of experiencing these practices. And so there's a need to focus on them. Over to you, Eve. In the context of Kenya or even East Africa, what is the key concern you have with conversion practices?
Thank you, Kanyo. And as Kanyo had said, is it working? Okay, better. So as Kanyo had mentioned, conversion therapy as an idea was very new in the Kenyan context and was very new in the context, East African context really, that my organization works in. So when initially we started the research work, we literally had to define what conversion therapy was, because at the time globally it was everywhere. The UK was banning and Australia was banning, and conversion therapy was the talk at the time. But in our context, a lot of people, including me, did not understand exactly what conversion therapy was, right? So when we started the work and we went into the ground, we started by definition, and people were like, oh, so that's what conversion therapy is. In that case, I know what that is because I have been through it, my friends have been through it, my family has taken somebody through this. So then it became very familiar. And some of the findings, right? So when we set out to do this work, we wanted to first identify practitioners. We wanted to understand what conversion therapy practices would look like in a Kenyan context. We wanted to document experiences and realities of survivors. We wanted to establish a link between the attitudes in Kenya, for example, the anti-homosexuality legislation in my country, and how those are tied to conversion therapy practices. And then, of course, create advocacy tool. What concerns me, like Kanyo has asked, is that we actually found the things we were looking for. And that's unfortunate because be careful what you ask for, right? We found that 73% of our respondents were aware of the availability of conversion therapy practices in the country. They were like, yeah, if you go there, you'll find this happening. 86% knew of a person. So they were like, there's somebody on speed dial, like we know if we call them, we can send children there, we can send people, we can send parents, right? And 12% of our respondents said they sought these practices themselves. Like they are the ones who went out, and for a variety of social and family challenges, right? Wanting to be accepted in your family, to keep a job, to keep their children when there was threat of their children being taken away because of their identity. So one of the things that stood out for me was how folks sort out conversion therapy practices, right? Because in my understanding of it, it was something that was being done to our community. So that stood out for me a little bit, that there are folks who went out to seek them. But then we had to ask ourselves, why? Why did adults feel the need to seek these out, right? The environments that we are in, the legislation in my country, and so on. Yeah. Is it on? Okay, thank you, Eve, highlighting really key findings from the research in Kenya, especially highlighting the hostile context in which people live to now they seek out these practices. I will mention that our colleagues will put in the chat box for those watching online links to the research, which you can definitely access. But over to you, Remy, what is the most concerning in the Nigeria context on conversion practices?
Thank you so much, Kayo. I hope everyone can hear me. All right. Two things were very distinct for me. And the first one is that parents are the initiators of conversion practices. That also leads to the fact that, what you were trying to say in terms of young persons as the most affected by conversion practices. The second thing that really stood out for me is that religious leaders are the biggest perpetrators of conversion practice in Nigeria. We carried out this research between 2019 and 2020. And in our finding, we did speak to over 2,000 LGBT plus persons in Nigeria. This work has actually also opened our minds to the fact that the reason why we document a lot of LGBT human rights abuses is because there's a general consensus that LGBT plus persons must change. That is, their sexual orientation must conform to the norm, their gender identity must conform to the binary code. And this also then leads to the fact that there's a huge knowledge gap in terms of parents who take their children for conversion practices, either to their religious leaders or to a health practitioners. There's a huge knowledge gap. And this is because there's a systematic approach to convincing the public that heterosexuality is the only way forward. In a historical analysis that was conducted in Nigeria, we did find that diverse sexual orientations did exist in Nigeria pre-colonial days. I also thank Steve for mentioning the colonial days, because the only thing that's actually un-African when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity is the received draconian laws. Because if we didn't have LGBT plus persons existing pre-colonial days, I'm sure that there wouldn't be a need to actually have those laws. So again, this got me thinking. If we've documented more than 2,000 cases of human rights abuses for LGBT plus persons on the perception of perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, and then we did find out that conversion practices is actually the incubator for violence that has then occurred subsequently, it then means that there is a problem with our legal framework. And I'm just going to quickly link this to the Constitution, because the Constitution provides that you cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of gender, on the basis of sex, etc. But it fails and continues to fail to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And this has led to a whole lot of issues, such as, for instance, this year alone, there's a blackmail issue that emerged, and the police in Nigeria said that they were not going to provide amnesty for victims of LGBT plus persons, according to the cyber attack that had happened. And Nigeria provides amnesty for Boko Haram, for instance. I don't know if any of you have heard about Boko Haram. These are persons who rape, kidnap, kill, people. But you would not provide amnesty for someone who has done nothing but have a different sexual orientation or gender identity. The fact that the Constitution does not, protect LGBT plus persons is the foundational problem, is the founding reason why there's conversion practices, there's human rights abuses against LGBT plus persons. The other example I want to give, in the Egbeda 57 case that was eventually struck out, was that in that case, while we were going to court, the police did make a public announcement to say that if anyone is LGBT plus persons, then Nigeria is not a home for them. While we are practicing true democracy, we must base our advocacy on the freedom of all persons, on the equity of all persons, and in ensuring that there's justice for every person. But right now, what we have is that we have a constitution which is founded on the principle of, democracy, which is government for the people. However, if we think that, 10% of LGBT plus persons live in Nigeria, it means that we are erasing and excluding 20 million persons in the country. So the greatest concern for me in our research is the fact that parents believe that a child's sexual orientation can change. And because of that, they willfully submit their children to experience violence of different kinds, to isolate their kids, and then this has a huge ripple effect. The effect might not immediate, and sometimes it is. For instance, we woke up to the news of a gay person being killed in Nigeria. We are getting to the threshold where it is okay to kill an LGBT plus person just because our constitution refuses to identify sexual orientation and gender identity as a discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy, highlighting some really concerning issues around the legal framework. Moving further afield, in China, what are the most concerning issues around conversion practices?
Thanks for letting me to join the panel. I think the experience in China on conversion therapy there are many similarity with what's happening in Africa and other countries. And I think, like we know in China, like conversion practice provided by state hospital and private counseling, and they use the way of like from electric shock to taking pills to other physical or mentally harm to our community. But I think it's a very systematically work practice. Because many people, when talk about the discrimination or conversion therapy, was because the main reason is because of the traditional family culture. It's true that many community member was taken to hospital by their parents, especially transgender kids. But that's not the whole picture, because why our parents take us to the hospital is because they lack of information. In China, the LGBT-related content was all the media will censor this kind of information, and lack of education as well, and also like the legal framework. Remy mentioned just now, it's very similar. Like the standard, the mental health standard in China, CCMD3, which ratified, updated in 2001, they remove homosexuality and bisexuality from the main category of the mental health disease, but they keep a category of with ego dystonic. Ego dystonic is a very similar situation like the DSM in second in the US. So people who cannot themselves as gay or bisexual still a mental health. So this standard put it into the textbook in the university or in the psychological professional training. So now, even now, the textbook still stating homosexuality and bisexuality is a mental health disease, and they teach how to converse. So, and also like the law in China, we don't have criminal law, or we neither have the anti-discrimination law. The legal system does not mention any about sexual orientation, gender identity. So we don't have policy to ban that. That's why when the hospital and the counseling, after they practice the conversion practice, no one, they won't receive any punish, or no government body responsible to this practice. So when the community member report to the government body, we don't know where to report. So it's systematically work. So when we advocate the entire conversion practice, we need to work with different legally, educational, and also to transfer the norm of the culture as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Yanzi. Raising some really important issues around accountability, especially for mental health and medical practitioners, and the lack of frameworks to hold them accountable. Now that brings me to a key question that I wish to pose to you, Steve, around legislative frameworks which seek to respond to some of these issues. I'll give the example in South Africa of the pending hate crimes bill, which basically seeks to address crimes committed against LGBTQ persons which are motivated by prejudice and intolerance. Of course, that is in the pipeline to become law, but it hasn't. I just want to understand, do you think such laws, as we as a continent grapple with the idea of banning conversion practices or responding legislatively through the law to these issues, do you think these laws actually have an impact? Do they have a role to play in eradicating conversion practices?
Yeah, I think so. I think one must accept that, you know, the Constitution fosters an environment where, you know, you allow a way of exercising the rights, but these rights comes with limitation. And sometimes, you know, when you look at what exists in the Constitution might not exist in the kind of legislations that you've put in place. So there's kind of inconsistencies and limitations and so forth that we always have to address. So by introducing some anti-discriminatory laws and so forth, bridges the gap on that. One must appreciate that if you look at our current criminal procedure, it only just speaks about the act. It doesn't speak about the motive. And why we have introduced the hate crime and hate speech legislation, first, for a country like ours, South Africa, we have a long history of prejudice. You know, apartheid, where we were discriminated because of the color of our skin. In a country that is dominated by black people were told, you walk there, you can't access there, and so forth. And that's a reality. Because of colonization and the history of colonization. And secondly, the same laws were used against, you know, women. Women can do this, women can't do this, and so forth. Thirdly, the same laws are used against LGBTI persons. So you have to realize that that biasness, that hate, the individuals and the groups they belong to are subjected to hate and many discriminatory elements. Now, in South Africa, it has taken us so long. It's now over 20 years, if I have to think about it, since we introduced the hate crime and hate speech conversation. At some point, we drafted hate crime law, a bill, and then we came back, we drafted hate speech. And then we dropped something along the way, and then now we brought it together. But I want to just show an example. In 2009, there was a case of this journalist who at some point became an ambassador to Uganda. And the journalist's name was John Kolane. You know, may his soul rest in hell wherever he is. But the point is, in 2009, when he was a journalist, he published a newspaper article, front cover, call me name, but gay is not okay. Now, what was problematic about this article? He had a picture and depicted a gay man getting married to a goat, an animal. And secondly, part of the article also depicted LGBTI people as in bestiality, which really sparked a whole lot of challenges and issues that we've had. I mean, this matter was taken through South African Human Rights Commission, the Equality Court, and so forth. The case was only concluded, by the way, just about a year ago. So you can imagine 12 years and so later. But what was unique about this matter, even going up and down, it questioned one of our acts, which is PEPUDA Act, which is the promotion for, what is PEPUDA? Oh, Equality and Unfair Discrimination Act. And there is a section under that act that speaks about whether hate speech perpetuate hatefulness harmfulness, and which the constitutional judges interrogated that. But it actually, through the judgment, even if he was found guilty, the judgment actually subjected Parliament for the next 24 months, which now they only have 12 months remaining, that they must actually redefine that section of the Pepuda Act. That's one. Two, it also pushes our own cabinet to actually move with the hate crimes and hate speech bill. I think I'm confident, because this is what we've always yearned for, that let there be a law that actually says that hate speech or any hate crime will be criminal. It cannot be tolerated. And why I'm also saying this, just a few weeks ago, we had, you know, I don't know, for those who have SABC and so forth in the region, there's a whole thing about pit bulls, you know, that have been going around killing children and so forth. Now, a white woman spoke in the, you know, in her Twitter and said, no, pit bulls are no problems, dogs are no problems. Kill the black people. They are the problems. And I'm raising all this intersectional lens because it's no difference when you talk about sexual orientation and you talk about blackness and you talk about women and so forth. They are all interconnected. So for me, these specific anti-discriminatory laws are important to bridge the gap between constitution and what doesn't exist.
Importance of bridging the gap between what the Constitution says and people's lived realities. So we are a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to ask my panelists to really try and be succinct. But I'm moving to you, Yanzi, just to touch on some of the key things Steve raised about how this, making an example on litigation, taking about 12 years to resolve one case. So do you think that, as someone who's worked through litigation to try and combat conversion practices, do you think litigation is something we should really focus on and invest more in as a tool in fighting these practices?
Yeah, for our work, yes. Litigation is a very important strategy. So in 2013, we have many community members who experience conversion therapy. They they speak out on social media, Chinese social media, talk about their story, uncover some hospital and clinics. But when we report to the government body, there are nothing happen. So we would like to find somebody who experienced conversion therapy can speak out to take the case to the court. But during the years, like community member, they struggle with coming out to their family and public. So nobody would want to take the case to the court. So in 2014, personally, I went to a clinic, counseling, who advertised themselves to provide electric shock conversion therapy on the internet. So I went to the clinic and I experienced once electric shock conversion therapy, and then I take them to the court in Beijing, in China, and luckily we won the case. It was the first time we used the, oh, thank you. It was the first time we LGBT movement in China try to use litigation as a tool to advocate for our rights. And in that verdict of the case, the judge stated 2 points. One is homosexuality is not a disease in the verdict. It was the first time the official documents state about this. And secondly, she states that advertisement promising gay cure is illegal. So it's a very powerful verdict, and we spread on the internet, on the media, all the government media talk about our case. And even our parents in a small village can see the TV talk about gay cure is illegal. But in the legal system in China is not case by case. It's like you need to change the law. So conversion practice still going on, but we use the opportunity to educate to the parents. And PFLAG China, they work with gay parents. They use our verdict to tell the educate to the parents. It's a very important message from the government documents. So in 2016, we have another case, another gay man who was living in a very small village. He was taken by their parents to the mental health hospital for 19 days. During the 19 days, he cannot get out of the hospital. He was enforced to take different kinds of pills. And also we rescue him and take the case to the court. We also won the case. Even during both these cases, the fine are very little, and the hospital and the psychologists, they just punish a very $3,000 or $5,000. But we still use this way to educate, to spread, to raise the public discussion on the media. But it's not enough. Like you can see, it's a very typical situation that in a LGBT community member live in a small village. When they find out by their parents, the first reaction is take to the hospital. But if we don't have any kinds of policy ban, the doctor can say anything to, they can do anything for money, just for money to cure, to practice the conversion therapy to the community. So I think we use the litigation as a tool, as a way to raise the discussion, to to request for the policy ban. It's crucial to stop our conversion therapy. Thanks.
Yanzi, highlighting some really complex issues around litigation and other opportunities to eradicate these practices. So I'm going to turn to you, Eve, and then you, Remy. If you can just briefly comment. We've spoken about using the courts, we've spoken about using the law. Outside of these frameworks, what have you found to be effective strategies to combat these practices?
My mic on? Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Oh, I definitely have to agree with Ian on that. Litigation, definitely take people to court so that they're scared of messing with you and they know there are consequences. The other thing that we've seen work in Kenya has been cross-movement building. We realized that it was important to have many people speaking on these issues, so it's not just us. It's not just those gay people talking about those gay rights, right? So building solidarity with, for example, young people. So the young people movement in Kenya, the feminist movement, the environmental impact movement, the social justice or movement against police brutality, with the doctors and nurses or all the workers. So you'll find people, me, my director, people from the community on the streets with these people when, for example, the doctors were on strike around the conditions of healthcare in our country. We were at the front line, of course with our rainbow flags, but we were at the front line of these movements as well, so that we are seen as Kenyan people who also experience the same issues that Kenyans experience, right? We are not just those special gay people in that corner. And that's what they've tried to do for a long time, make us look like we are special people looking for special rights, right? So we were countering that. And also having many people speaking on these issues has helped, so that when we have social media campaigns, we have people who do random things, so leave alone corporate and leave alone like lawyers. We have like mothers of children with albinism speaking on LGBTQ plus issues and being like, these human rights for queer people is just as important as human rights for disabled people in Kenya. The other thing we have, I'll call it advocacy, but it's just creating friends in different places, so that when something is happening in spaces that we don't occupy, we are given a heads up. An example was when, for example, they wanted to introduce a bill in our parliament that was talking about finding out where we get our money. So they wanted to track where when I say queer, I mean LGBTIQ plus broadly, queer organizations in Kenya are getting our money. They had it all written, they were ready, they were about to table it in parliament, and our friends in parliament called us and they were like, do you know this is happening? We were like, what? So by the time we were trying to lobby, advocate, call our friends and call for favors, by the time the newspapers were finding out about it and printing it first page, we already knew. We already knew this was happening. We were already in conversations with people who could help us. And fortunately, this bill did not go through thanks to our human rights caucus at the parliament. They were able to call in favors and stop it. So it never went through. And this was an example of having, I wouldn't say friends in high places, but friends in places where we can't access. That has helped as well. And the last one, because of time, I'll talk about a communication strategy. So when we were doing litigation in Kenya, we are currently in court trying to repeal those colonial laws that criminalize some parts of our identities. We had a really thorough social media and communications campaign. So while the litigation continued, we were out here just not only educating people about why we were in court, but the importance of the human rights of LGBTIQ plus people and how that affects everyone, right? So for example, just making those linkages, and we're like, if they're coming for us, they're coming for you next, you know, and why it's important for us to stick together and solidarity. And we saw a huge shift. So for example, when we started our case in 2017 thereabout, when we went to court, it was just activists. And you could tell, like, we are known. So it was just like the 10 of us at the front of the court. By the time we were going for our last judgment, the court was so full, the courtroom was so full, people were standing outside the corridor, people were outside in the streets, right, in solidarity with us. We had young people from colleges, people who'd never come out before, standing with us and being like, we got you. So we saw how that also shifted the perception and shifted the, for example, I won't call it hearts and minds because that's very American, but like hearts and minds.
All right. For us at TS, the other strategies that we've put in place is, first of all, documenting these human rights abuses. This helps to create a body of evidence that we can use to engage stakeholders, lawmakers, and even the African Commission. Without this evidence, it's almost like you're just in your feelings, you're just creating scenarios, this never happened. So documenting these human rights abuses has really helped us to create a body of evidence. From our research, with the other thing we are doing with it is to look at the difference between conversion practices that has occurred 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because the average number of persons we actually interviewed were between 18 and 35. And it means that they had gone through conversion practices at a very younger age. So what we did with our research in terms of strategy is to look at what is actually happening in 2022 when it comes to conversion practices. And so with that, we hired investigative journalists to actually go to different churches, engage with medical practitioners, you know, to see if this, you know, practices still exist. And to be very honest, they do. A lot of religious leaders would take money with the hope that, you know, your sexual orientation can be changed, your gender identity can be changed. So putting together this documentary really helps to show that even though some of the findings from our research is from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there is still a very high chance that conversion practices continue to exist. Apart from that, one of the things that was very apparent is the knowledge gap when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. A lot of heterosexual people don't know that heterosexuality is a spectrum of social sexual orientation, right? They kind of assume that, oh, I'm straight, so therefore I'm not part of SOGI. We have to break it down that everyone actually has a sexual orientation. And with a lot of research that has occurred, at least 50% of the world's population have been queer at some point or the other. We are all aware in this space that sexuality is very fluid, so there's nothing wrong with that. But the point is that there's a lot of knowledge, trying to close the knowledge gap that exists with parents to help them understand heterosexuality is a sexual orientation. And there's nothing wrong with someone else having a different sexual orientation than what you're used to. This is also very important in engaging with the National Human Rights Commission, which has the mandate to protect all human rights, regardless of your sexual orientation or gender identity. And there's a huge knowledge gap. The most shocking of them all is that despite the classification of homosexuality as a mental illness, a lot of health practitioners still believe that homosexuality or having a diverse gender identity is a mental illness, even though they did go to school and they did learn that, this is wrong. So the last point, just for the sake of time, I'm going to put out is using storytelling as an advocacy tool. This is so important because every time mainstream media talks about LGBT plus persons in Nigeria, it's always in the negative light. Very quickly, I'm going to give an example of a journalist who last year went on national TV and said, when she was in her teenage years, her brother slapped the gay out of her because she was a tomboy. Narrating stories like that to the public presents an opportunity for parents who are worried about their queer child and say, if this reporter who is successful, who is doing well, can have their sexual orientation changed, it means that I can also do that for my child. So providing alternative narratives to say, there's nothing wrong with having a diverse sexual orientation actually does help. And how we're able to measure the work that we do is that between 2015 and 2022, we've been able to reduce the perception of LGBT plus persons by 40%. That is 98% of persons who were in support of the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act as of 2015 have changed their minds now because we've been strategic in how we ask our questions. We basically put in their face, would you send your child to jail for having a different sexual orientation? The usual answer is no. But I know that we still have a lot of work to do, but these are some of the strategies that we put in place so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remy and Eve, for very important strategies. I know we are completely out of time, but and I had many questions to ask these panelists about very important issues, even at the regional level. But we will not be able to get into that. What we will have time for is about 2 or 3 questions before our panelists move away from the stage. So I am opening the floor for any questions, thoughts, comments, reflections. Also online, if you can let me know who's managing the online engagement, if there are any questions or reflections. So you guys were amazing. People have no... Please.
Yeah, I've got questions to the end because you introduced about the common society practice to the youth trans people. So could you introduce more about what's the youth trans people in China? What's the experience to the common therapy, or what's the different practice for the gay community and the trans communities? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take maybe 1 or 2 more before we hand it back to our panelists. There's another.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if there are things that you tried that didn't work that we could learn from. That, obviously understanding that things might be specific to your country or region, but are there practices or things that you tried that just didn't work that we could possibly learn from those experiences to not repeat that?
And then 1 more, and I think 1 more that side.
A few of you mentioned around using social media and communication strategies to advocate for LGBTQIA plus people. I was wondering, in situations like mentioned in China and the constitution in Africa not representing LGBT folk, whether there have been reprisals for activists online advocating on this topic, and particularly in China where the social media is different, given the state policies, whether there's retaliation on people using the internet for activism.
Did I see one more there, or did I see it here? Okay, I think that will be our last one, and then we'll hand back to our speakers.
All right. Thank you so much for the elaborate submissions. My question is around, conversion practices that are exported into our different regions. What do you think that, what should people who, say they support us, maybe the American audience, because a lot of homophobia is exported from here and brought through religion, what should our partners in the United States do to make sure that these practices do not continue to be exported to our countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Pepe, for that question. So we have one on, I think, if I heard it correctly, transgender persons and conversion practices, one about strategies that don't work, as opposed to the ones you've highlighted, which do, and then social media in hostile contexts, and finally, exported conversion practices. I will kindly ask you to be super brief so that you can have your 30 seconds to have your call to action after we answer questions, please. Over to you, Yanzi.
Okay, so there are two main differences for the trans community when facing the challenge of conversion therapy. One is the age, because most of the gay and lesbian community, they hide their identity to their family, to their workplace. So they experience conversion therapy when they are more mature in their workplace, find out by their parents. But for the trans kids, they are so obviously because the gender expressions. So most of our community, trans community, they experience conversion therapy by their parents taking to the hospital is when they were very young, like 14 to like under 18. This face another challenge that is very difficult for us to provide legal aid to the kids because they have a legal guardianship is their parents. So our lawyers is very difficult to like provide legal aid to them. And another thing is there are many informal schools. They provide conversion therapy to trans kids, not hospital, not counseling. It's a very illegal school, but we can't like take down them. Yeah, that's the two main challenge. I would like to referring to the challenge of social media for the individual is totally okay to express their like how to say their contents like on social media, but for LGBT organizations is face a lot of challenge. Even our organizations was enforced to close last year because we organize people on different ways. So for activists and organizations will face a lot of risky or challenge on social media, but for individual it's okay. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Hi everyone. I think I would try to answer the question around what has failed. You wanted to do that? Okay. And maybe I can also touch on Pepe's question. In our case, I think one of the things that maybe we didn't do well was the engagement with religious leaders. Because even though we extended invitations to 60 of them, only 15 granted the invitation to attend the focal group discussion that we had with them. And out of that 15, 13 actually, came in physically. I think maybe our approach, what we can do better next time, is to actually find someone in the religious space doing the work from the internal lens, rather than us approaching it as outsiders. And I think that's what we can do better going forward. I mean, if you look at the way homosexuality has been declassified, we did actually have to have a psychologist, work from inside and then out. And I think that maybe we would adopt that strategy going forward. In terms of what can we do, what can partners in the United States do with banning conversion practices? I would say, please criminalize anyone who comes to Africa specifically to promote conversion practices. If there's a law that exists in America that says you cannot convert anyone, you can practice conversion practices, then why is it okay for you to do it somewhere else? The United States should do better with criminalizing those that promote conversion practices everywhere. Thank you.
I'll also respond, that's why I laughed, I'll also respond to the question about what doesn't work or what didn't work. The first thing that came to my mind was having other people represent us or speak for us or speak on our behalf. And for a long time, because we didn't know better, we thought that was the right thing, right? So having, for example, missions and donors and funders and allies from Global North speaking on our behalf, that did a number on this cause for us, and trying to reverse it has been really difficult. But now we try to speak for ourselves. We are the face of the movement. Queer people are writing statements. Lawyers are, or the people that speak on our behalf are queer or endorsed by queer people. We are the face of the queer movement in Kenya, and that was really important. So having your own people doing the work, I think. We learned from that. And Pepe's question about what to do about people who import queer phobia to our countries. There's now a running joke from Advocacy Week, and it's arrest those criminals and arrest them. That's it.
Thank you so much, Eve. We are completely out of time, so I'm going to just ask you, Steve, maybe if you can very briefly respond to any questions, but your final call to action also on behalf of colleagues. What is urgent? What do we need to do to eradicate convergent practices?
Yeah, I think my colleagues have touched a lot on the questions, but maybe on the issue of internet. While we are in the fourth industrial revolution, the use of social media can be excellent, but also can be harmful. And I want us to guard against that. In other countries where there's a lot of censorship, social media is not working well, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, and so forth. People are censored, or also in other places, it's actually an immediate, fast-tracked way to bullying and harassing LGBTI persons. So it does work when we do awareness and promoting other things, but sometimes social media also work against us because it's an effective tool others use as a weapon against us. Can you maybe just quickly, because I'm not going to touch Pepe's point, it was said, we cannot afford any of the global north countries to shift responsibility. Criminalize, because we know the past colonization came by ship, now it's coming by flight, and it's faster. So criminalize them while they are in your ground. We did that. An example that we did that, we banned Stephen Lewis, I don't know his surname. He came when he was planning to come to South Africa. We banned him, we denied him visa. When he was planning to Botswana, we mobilized the Botswanas, they denied visa. We mobilized Malawi, they denied visa. So we want the Americans to do the same, to criminalize them. So what is urgent? I think the 3 years have taught us an example of what could actually, when you understand a particular issue as conversion practice. The fact that, YV was raising the point that we needed to actually localize conversion practice. For us as Africans, we needed to do so. We needed to identify, we needed to look at what are some of the pathways of conversion practice besides just the clinical aspect, which is a therapy, and there's nothing therapeutic about it anyway. So, but the point, what is urgent now, there are engagements that must happen with parents, with school governing bodies, with religious institutions, with traditional institutions. For the first time in South Africa, the House of Traditional and Khoisan Leaders, which is a parliament section, sat and engaged around Soji for the first time. So while there's commitments of saying that let's open up all the provincial, those are needed. So we need resources, Maria, and this is a clarion call to outright. This is a clarion call to outright, and I'm glad I can see the Netherlands are here, because this was an investment by the Netherlands people. It cannot end now while we are actually getting it right. I think research is out. Now we want to utilize this research as part of operational research to advocate for change, to educate people, but also most importantly to save lives. And the business of saving lives is what we need to invest more and more. So I think what is urgent, let's put resources and let's invest more for another 3 years. Cheers to that.
Thank you, Steve, for ending us off on such a high and important note. I want to quickly thank the Dutch government, Anita May Rosenstein Foundation, and Microsoft for the support of this event. But I also want to thank these amazing panelists. Please give them a round of applause.